14 years of silence can break in a single moment. In 1982, two teenagers vanished from the quiet streets of Logan, Ohio, their bodies discovered days later in woods known only to locals. The case grew cold as seasons turned to years, evidence gathered dust, and a community learned to live with unanswered questions. Then one morning in 1996, a man walked into a police station and shattered that silence forever. What he confessed would prove that some secrets refuse to stay buried. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning sun filtered through maple trees surrounding Logan High School, casting long shadows across the parking lot where students gathered before first period. Summer 1982 carried the promise of freedom for graduating seniors, and nowhere was that optimism brighter than in the conversation between Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz. Annette laughed at something Todd whispered, her eyes bright with the kind of happiness that comes from being 18 and believing the world holds infinite possibilities. They leaned against Todd's car, discussing graduation plans and summer jobs with the casual confidence of young people who had never encountered real danger. "You two are inseparable?" a classmate teased as she walked past. "What's the plan for tonight?" "Nothing special," Annette replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Maybe drive around, see who's at the lake." The anonymous phone call Annette had received the previous evening seemed insignificant than just a wrong number or teenage prank. Years later, that fleeting detail would haunt investigators who wondered if someone had been watching, planning, waiting. The final bell rang at 3:15. Students poured from the building. Annette and Todd walked to the parking lot together, making plans they would never keep, discussing a future that would be stolen before sunset. By 5:30 that evening, worry crept into two households. Annette's mother checked the kitchen clock, then walked to the window. Dinner was ready, and Annette was never late without calling. 3 miles away, Todd's father stood in his driveway, scanning the road. Todd had promised to help with yard work, a commitment he never broke. At 6 o'clock, the families began making phone calls. No one had seen them since school. Their usual hangout spots were empty. The lake where teenagers gathered held no trace of the missing couple. By 7 o'clock, both families discovered something chilling. Annette's purse sat on her bedroom dresser, untouched. Todd's wallet lay on his nightstand, containing college savings. Neither teenager had planned to disappear. Annette's father called the sheriff's office at 7:30. "My daughter didn't come home from school. This isn't like her." The dispatcher followed protocol. Teenagers sometimes stayed out late, fought with parents, made impulsive decisions. Unless there were signs of foul play, they waited 24 hours. But by 8 o'clock, as darkness settled over Logan, the dispatcher's advice felt inadequate. These were responsible young people who had simply vanished. Neighbors noticed police cruisers first. Mrs. Henderson watched from her kitchen window as a deputy took notes. Word spread through Logan with small-town efficiency. Something had happened to Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz. When darkness fell over Hocking County, the search began. Sheriff's deputies organized volunteers at the high school, dividing the town into search grids. Flashlight beams swept across rural roads and wooded areas. Detective Morrison arrived shortly after 9 o'clock, his weathered face reflecting the gravity of the situation. In 14 years of law enforcement, he had learned to trust his instincts, and everything about this disappearance felt wrong. Two 18-year-olds, both reliable kids, the shift supervisor reported. Left school together around 3:15. No contact since. Personal items left at home. Detective Morrison studied the map spread across his patrol car hood. Logan sat in Ohio's Appalachian foothills, surrounded by dense forests and winding back roads known only to locals. The first potential evidence emerged before midnight. A volunteer near Tar Hollow Road discovered fresh tire tracks in soft earth beside the pavement. The impressions were clear and recent, leading toward a clearing hidden by thick underbrush. Detective Morrison photographed the tracks from multiple angles, though forensic capabilities in 1982 were limited. Without a suspect vehicle, the tracks were merely suggestive rather than definitive. Weather worked against them after 2 in the morning. Thick fog rolled in, reducing visibility to 50 feet. Flashlight beams created ghostly halos in the mist. "We need to pull back until dawn," Detective Morrison announced reluctantly. "Nobody gets hurt. Looking for these kids." The families refused to stop searching. Annette's father and Todd's brother continued walking the roads, calling their names into the fog, hoping for an answer that never came. Dawn brought no relief. Detective Morrison returned before sunrise, his mind racing through possibilities none of them wanted to consider. The command post moved indoors, transforming the conference room into a nerve center of maps and witness statements. Fresh coffee sat untouched as deputies prepared for another day of searching. Interviews began at 7 o'clock. Detective Morrison methodically questioned friends, teachers, and acquaintances, searching for any detail that might explain their disappearance. Did they have any enemies? He asked classmates in the high school library. The question seemed absurd. Annette and Todd were kind, well-liked students without controversy. They were the couple everyone expected to marry after college. Nobody disliked them, one friend insisted. They were just nice, really, really nice. But one detail emerged. A witness remembered seeing a white van idling in the school parking lot during lunch the previous day. The vehicle seemed out of place, newer than typical work trucks, with windows too dark to see inside. "Did you get a license plate?" Detective Morrison asked. The witness shook his head. "I barely noticed it. It was just sitting there, then gone." 3 other students recalled a similar vehicle, though descriptions varied. Some remembered a van, others a pickup truck. The color ranged from white to gray to pale blue. Local radio stations broadcast descriptions hourly. Tips flooded the sheriff's office, most worthless, but each requiring investigation because buried within false leads might be the detail that would break the case. The call came Thursday morning, 48 hours after the disappearance. A deer hunter near Tar Hollow Road had discovered something that would transform a missing persons case into double homicide. Detective Morrison drove through morning mist that clung to valleys. The location was isolated, accessible only by a narrow dirt path winding through dense forest for nearly a mile. The hunter stood beside his pickup, face pale and hands shaking. "They're back there," he said quietly. "I saw the clothes first, then." Detective Morrison walked carefully toward the clearing, mindful not to disturb evidence. The scene confirmed every fear that had been building for 2 days. Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz lay in tall grass, partially concealed by fallen branches that appeared deliberately placed. Both teenagers had been victims of violence. "Secure the perimeter," Detective Morrison radioed. "Nobody else comes through until the state crime lab arrives." The isolation troubled him immediately. This wasn't random. It was a place known only to someone familiar with Hocking County's backwoods. The killer had intimate local knowledge. Drag marks indicated the bodies had been moved after death, transported from another location. The killer had taken time to hide his crimes, to delay discovery. The medical examiner arrived at noon, followed by photographers and evidence technicians. The clearing buzzed with quiet, methodical activity, as professionals documented every detail. Preliminary examination revealed both victims had suffered violent attacks. Their conditions suggested they had been deceased approximately 2 days, consistent with Tuesday afternoon's timeline. Word spread through Logan like wildfire. Radio bulletins interrupted programming. Church bells rang solemnly as reality settled. Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz were never coming home. The autopsy confirmed Detective Morrison's fears. Both teenagers had been murdered, their lives ended by violence that spoke to either rage or calculated cruelty. The medical examiner's report painted a clinical picture of brutality. "Some fiber evidence under the fingernails," he reported. "Rope fibers. Possibly from restraints. I've preserved everything for the state lab." Forensic capabilities in 1982 were primitive. DNA analysis was experimental and unavailable. Fingerprint databases were manual and incomplete. The rope fibers represented their best hope, though without a suspect for comparison, the evidence remained merely potential. Funeral arrangements began, though the investigation prevented families from claiming bodies for days. The delay added anguish to grief that already seemed unbearable. Annette's mother sat surrounded by relatives who had driven from across Ohio. Todd's father stood in his garage, staring at yard work his son had promised to help with, unable to comprehend a world that could destroy such innocence. Community response was overwhelming. Food appeared on doorsteps faster than families could acknowledge. Flowers filled front yards. Neighbors took over everyday responsibilities, understanding that grief made simple tasks impossible. Local churches organized prayer services drawing hundreds. Pastor Williams spoke about evil that defied understanding and faith that endured in darkness, offering comfort though some struggled to reconcile beliefs with brutality. The investigation continued around the clock. Detective Morrison and colleagues interviewed anyone who might have information. Tips poured in from across the region, each requiring verification. The investigation consumed Detective Morrison's days and haunted his nights. Every lead dissolved under scrutiny. Every witness proved less reliable than hope. Every piece of potential evidence led to dead ends. The white van became the focus of intensive searching that yielded nothing concrete. Descriptions varied so widely, investigators couldn't determine if they sought one vehicle or several, if sightings were connected or coincidental. 3 suspects emerged from early investigation. A recently released convict with violence history had been in the area. A drifter, passing through Logan, had argued with teenagers at a diner. A school maintenance worker displayed what colleagues called inappropriate interest in female students. Each suspect was thoroughly investigated and eliminated. The convict had been in Columbus visiting his parole officer. The drifter had moved to West Virginia. The maintenance worker had been home with his sick wife. Detective Morrison expanded investigation beyond Logan, contacting agencies across Ohio and neighboring states. Similar crimes might reveal patterns or traveling suspects. The search revealed several unsolved cases involving young couples, but none matched Logan's specific characteristics. The killer's location choice, concealment method, and dump site all pointed to local knowledge rather than transient predator. Anonymous tips flooded phone lines. Most proved worthless grudges against neighbors, paranoid suspicions, simple mistakes, but each required investigation because Detective Morrison knew that buried within false leads might be crucial information. Public pressure mounted as weeks passed without arrest. County commissioners demanded updates. State politicians visited to express sympathy and promise resources. The governor assigned additional investigators. By late 1982, terrible reality had settled over Logan. The killer might never be caught. Despite the most intensive investigation in county history, the case was stalling. Detective Morrison sat in his office on a gray November morning, surrounded by evidence boxes that had consumed 4 months. Rope fibers remained preserved, waiting for forensic technology that might never arrive. Tire tracks had been cataloged, but without a suspect vehicle, they proved nothing. The decision to suspend active investigation came from above, though Detective Morrison understood the necessity. Other crimes demanded attention. Limited resources couldn't be devoted indefinitely to a case showing no progress. Files were boxed and moved to cold storage, though Detective Morrison kept copies in his desk. Rope fiber evidence was carefully preserved with notes explaining its potential significance. "We're not giving up," he assured families during a meeting that felt like a funeral. "This case stays open. If new evidence emerges, if technology advances, if someone comes forward, we'll be ready." The community organized a candlelight vigil, drawing nearly 1,000 participants to the high school stadium. Pastor Williams offered prayers for families and divine justice that seemed increasingly unlikely through earthly means. Students and teachers lit candles in memory of classmates who should have been planning college instead of lying in graves. The flame ceremony became annual tradition, a way for Logan to remember without dwelling in perpetual grief. Detective Morrison attended every vigil for 14 years, standing in the back, watching faces for signs of guilt that never appeared. Somewhere in that gathering, he believed, the killer might be hiding among mourners. The mid-1980s brought forensic advances that rekindled hope for cold cases. DNA analysis emerged as revolutionary technology, though it remained expensive and time-consuming for smaller agencies. Detective Morrison made annual pilgrimages to cold storage. The Cooper-Schultz file had grown thick with follow-up reports and scientific analyses yielding more questions than answers. In 1987, he discovered a misfiled document overlooked for 5 years. Phone records showing Annette had received a call from a public booth near the woods where her body was found. The call lasted 30 seconds and occurred the evening before disappearance. The discovery energized Detective Morrison, though the trail had grown cold. The phone booth had been removed during highway improvements. Security cameras hadn't existed in 1982. Any evidence of who made that call had vanished. Still, the record suggested premeditation. Someone had contacted Annette the night before, possibly to arrange the meeting that led to death. The killer wasn't a stranger who encountered them randomly. He could obtain Annette's number and convince her to come to a predetermined location. Detective Morrison re-interviewed family and friends about the mysterious call. Annette's mother remembered her mentioning someone calling and hanging up, but she hadn't seemed concerned. "Wrong numbers happened constantly," her mother explained. "We didn't have caller ID. Kids got prank calls all the time." The Logan Daily News marked the 5th anniversary with front-page story titled, "Unsolved Mysteries Haunt County." The article reviewed evidence and pleaded for information, though Detective Morrison held little hope that time would loosen tongues sealed for 5 years. The late 1980s brought systematic re-interviews as Detective Morrison contacted everyone questioned during original investigation. Memory played tricks after years, with witnesses sometimes contradicting earlier statements or adding forgotten details. One conversation proved intriguing. A former classmate mentioned that Annette had confided her fear about a man in a pickup truck who seemed to be following her during weeks before death. She said he would drive slowly past her house or sit in parking lots when she was shopping, the witness recalled. She thought maybe he was looking at her car, but it made her uncomfortable. Detective Morrison pressed for details, but the witness provided only vague descriptions filtered through fading memory. The vehicle had been dark-colored, the driver appeared middle-aged white male, but she had never seen him clearly. The description didn't match original suspects, though Detective Morrison understood that witness memory became unreliable over time. He added information to the growing file and circulated descriptions to neighboring agencies. Other interviews yielded contradictory information, complicating rather than clarifying investigation. Some witnesses remembered details never mentioned before. Others retracted statements made with certainty in 1982. Time seemed to erode truth as much as preserve it. The community's relationship with the unsolved case evolved. Initial shock gave way to resigned acceptance that justice might never arrive. Some preferred not to discuss the murders. Others remained obsessed, developing elaborate theories about suspects. Rumors flourished absent facts. Gossip identified potential killers based on circumstantial evidence or personal animosity. Detective Morrison investigated each allegation, understanding that public cooperation depended on taking every tip seriously. Early 1990s brought new hope through advanced forensic capabilities. The Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation acquired sophisticated equipment for analyzing trace evidence, including microscopic examination tools, revealing previously invisible details. Detective Morrison submitted preserved rope fibers for reanalysis, hoping improved technology might yield undetectable information from 1982. Results confirmed original findings while adding crucial specificity. Fibers came from manila rope with distinctive weave pattern manufactured by only 3 companies nationwide. Investigation revealed one company supplied rope to hardware stores throughout Ohio, including Sullivan's Hardware in Logan. Store records from 1982 had been destroyed, but the connections suggested local acquisition rather than outside materials. The forensic analyst provided additional details. The rope contained a manufacturing defect affecting less than 5% of production, making it potentially identifiable if suspect rope could be located. This is exactly the evidence that could solve the case, the analyst explained. If you find the source rope, we can make definitive match. Discovery prompted community-wide search for similar rope, though Detective Morrison knew chances of finding the actual weapon after 9 years were minimal. Still, evidence specificity provided new investigation avenues. Families throughout Hocking County received deputy visits asking to examine rope stored in garages and barns. Most residents cooperated willingly, understanding the request might help solve the county's most notorious crime. The search yielded several manila rope samples, including some with distinctive weave patterns. Laboratory analysis ruled out each as potential matches, but the process demonstrated that leads could still be pursued despite passing years. The state announced funding for DNA analysis of major unsolved cases, though Cooper-Schultz investigation presented challenges. Biological evidence from 1982 had been minimal and partially degraded by storage conditions that hadn't anticipated future forensic needs. Detective Morrison's commitment to solving the case had become legendary within Ohio law enforcement. Colleagues knew he kept victim photographs on his office wall and reviewed files regularly, as if constant attention might reveal overlooked details. The personal toll was evident. Detective Morrison had aged visibly, his hair completely gray, face marked by strain of countless disappointing leads and dead ends. During quiet moments in his home office, he recorded audio memos reviewing evidence and exploring new theories. These recordings became therapy, allowing him to organize thoughts and maintain hope that justice would eventually arrive. Day 3847, since the murders, he dictated one evening in 1993. Still convinced someone in Logan knows more than they've told. Still believe the killer is local, probably still living in the area. Still determined to see this case solved before I retire. His wife had stopped asking about the case, understanding that her husband's obsession was both necessary and destructive. She watched him carry the weight of 2 families' grief, knowing his promise to find their children's killer had become his career's defining commitment. The 10th anniversary brought renewed media attention and community reflection. The Logan Daily News published retrospective series examining how the unsolved case had shaped the town's character and residents' security sense. were different people than in 1982, one resident observed. More careful, suspicious, less trusting of strangers. Those kids' deaths took something from all of us. The anniversary vigil drew the largest crowd since initial years, suggesting community memory remained strong despite time's passage. Detective Morrison stood at the back, scanning faces for reactions that might reveal guilty knowledge. Somewhere among those hundreds of candles, he remained convinced, was the person who could finally provide answers. The breakthrough came without warning on a cold February morning in Clay, 1996. Chester Mcnite walked into the Hocking County Sheriff's Office and asked to speak with the detective in charge of the Cooper-Schultz investigation. The desk sergeant initially assumed he was another citizen with a tip, but Mcnite's opening words changed everything. "I killed those two kids in 1982, he said quietly, hands folded as he sat across from Detective Morrison in the interview room. "I can't live with it anymore." Detective Morrison had dreamed of this moment for 14 years, though he struggled to maintain professional composure as confession began. Mcnite appeared to be in his 50s, unremarkable in appearance, speaking in calm voice suggesting resignation rather than relief. "Tell me what happened," Detective Morrison said, activating his tape recorder and reciting formal warnings that Mcnite waved with a simple nod. The confession unfolded slowly, with Mcnite providing details only the killer could have known. He described the isolated clearing where bodies were found, the condition in which they were left, and the specific manner they had been concealed with fallen branches. "I followed them from the school," Mcnite explained, "called the girl the night before and told her to meet me at Tar Hollow Road, said I had information about her friend who was in trouble." Detective Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he took notes, recognizing details that matched the mysterious phone call recorded in evidence 14 years earlier. Mcnite's knowledge extended beyond what had been published or discussed publicly. "I had rope in my truck," Mcnite continued, voice barely above a whisper. "Tied them up in the woods then. I killed them, moved the bodies to that clearing afterward, thought nobody would find them there." The confession lasted 3 hours, with Mcnite answering every question Detective Morrison posed. He provided a hand-drawn map of the dump site matching crime scene, photographs exactly. He described victims' clothing with accuracy, eliminating any possibility of false confession. When asked why he was coming forward after so many years, Mcnite offered no clear explanation. "Conscience, I guess. Couldn't carry it anymore." Verification began immediately, with Detective Morrison and the forensic analyst comparing Mcnite's confession against preserved evidence. Every detail checked out with disturbing precision. Mcnite knew Annette had been wearing a yellow t-shirt, though that information had been withheld from public reports. He described Todd's red polo shirt and khaki pants accurately. He provided crime scene details that only the killer or investigating officers could have known. Most significantly, he led deputies to a location near his property where he claimed to have discarded the rope used to restrain victims. Forensic analysis confirmed the recovered rope matched fibers found under Annette's fingernails 14 years earlier, including the distinctive manufacturing defect, affecting less than 5% of production. "It's definitely the murder weapon," the forensic analyst confirmed after microscopic examination. "Same manufacturer, same batch, same unique characteristics. No question about it." News of Mcnite's arrest spread through Logan within hours, carried by radio bulletins and phone calls that raced through the community faster than any official announcement. After 14 years of silence, the Cooper-Schultz case had finally been solved. Media descended from across Ohio and neighboring states, transforming the quiet town into a circus of television trucks and reporters seeking interviews. The sheriff's office implemented security measures to protect families from unwanted intrusion during what should have been private closure. Detective Morrison fielded dozens of calls from other agencies asking about the confession and its implications for unsolved cases in their jurisdictions. Mcnite had Douse's way, lived in several states during the 1980s and early 1990s, raising questions about whether other crimes might be connected. The prosecutor's office began preparing for what promised to be a high-profile trial, though Mcnite's detailed confession and corroborating physical evidence made conviction appear certain. The challenge would be managing public interest and ensuring intense media attention didn't compromise legal proceedings. Community reaction ranged from relief to outrage to renewed grief for families forced to relive their worst nightmare. Some residents expressed satisfaction that justice would finally be served, while others questioned why Mcnite had remained silent for so many years, while two families endured decades of uncertainty. Formal indictment came 3 weeks after Mcnite's confession, charging him with 2 counts of aggravated murder and additional charges related to kidnapping and violent abuse of Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz. The prosecutor's office announced their intention to seek maximum sentence under Ohio law. Defense attorney Martinez accepted the court-appointed case with full knowledge of its challenges. Mcnite had confessed in detail, led police to physical evidence, and provided information corroborating his guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Her strategy focused on questioning his mental state and exploring whether his confession had been coerced. Every defendant deserves competent representation, she explained to reporters who questioned her willingness to defend someone who had admitted to such horrific crimes. The system only works if we ensure proper procedures are followed and constitutional rights are protected. Pre-trial hearings drew packed audiences to the courthouse, forcing officials to implement a lottery system for public seating. Many residents who had followed the case for 14 years felt entitled to witness legal proceedings that would finally bring closure. Judge Thompson assumed responsibility for managing the trial with dignity that such significant case demanded. He imposed strict guidelines on media coverage and courtroom conduct, understanding that community healing depended partly on seeing justice administered fairly and thoroughly. Mcnite's arraignment provided the first public glimpse of the man who had confessed to Logan's most notorious crimes. He appeared smaller and older than many residents had imagined, speaking softly when asked to enter his plea and showing no obvious signs of mental illness or emotional disturbance. The defense attorney's motion to suppress the confession was denied after hearings established Mcnite had waived his rights voluntarily and provided his statement without coercion or promises of leniency. Court records showed he had specifically declined to have an attorney present during initial confession, stating he wanted to get it over with. Discovery revealed additional evidence strengthening prosecution's court case. Mcnite's employment records showed he had worked for a landscaping company in 1982, giving him familiarity with rural areas around Logan, where bodies were discovered. His truck matched witness descriptions of suspicious vehicles seen near the high school. The trial began on a crisp October morning in 1996, with Judge Thompson's opening remarks establishing the gravity of proceedings and court's commitment to ensuring both justice for victims and fairness for the defendant. The packed courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor rose to deliver his opening statement. 14 years ago, 2 innocent teenagers were brutally murdered by the defendant, Chester Mcnite. The prosecutor began, his voice carrying the weight of community's long-delayed demand for justice. Today, we will prove beyond reasonable doubt that he planned their deaths, lured them to an isolated location, and ended their lives with premeditation and cruelty. The opening statement outlined prosecution's case methodically, the mysterious phone call that preceded murders, the detailed confession only the killer could have provided, and physical evidence that corroborated Mcnite's admission of guilt. The prosecutor emphasized that the case rested not on circumstantial evidence or witness testimony, but on defendant's own words and actions. Defense attorney Martinez faced an almost impossible task. Rather than denying Mcnite's involvement, she focused on questioning his mental state and circumstances that led to his confession after 14 years of silence. "You will hear evidence that my client suffers from severe depression and other mental health issues that may have affected his judgment," she told the jury. "We ask that you consider whether his confession truly represents an accurate account of events or the tortured ramblings of a man consumed by guilt over matters unrelated to these tragic deaths." The prosecution's first witness was Detective Morrison, whose testimony provided foundation for everything that followed. He described the original investigation in detail, the years of frustrated leads and dead ends, and the shocking moment when Mcnite walked into his office with full confession. "In 25 years of law enforcement, I had never experienced anything like it," Detective Morrison testified. "He knew details about the crime scene that we had never released to the public. He drew maps that matched our photographs exactly. He provided information that only the killer could have possessed." The confession recording played in the courtroom, Mcnite's voice filling silence as he described murders in clinical detail. Several jury members appeared uncomfortable listening to the matter-of-fact recounting of violence against 2 young people who should have been planning their futures. The second day focused on forensic evidence corroborating Mcnite's confession. The forensic analyst took the witness stand with charts and photographs demonstrating scientific connections between defendant's statements and physical evidence recovered from the crime scene. The rope fibers found under Annette Cooper's fingernails are microscopically identical to the rope recovered from the defendant's property, the analyst testified. The probability of coincidence is statistically impossible. These fibers came from the same source, the rope used to restrain the victims before their deaths. The analyst explained the manufacturing defect's significance that made the rope identifiable after 14 years. The distinctive weave pattern appeared in less than 5% of production, providing unique fingerprint connecting evidence to Mcnite's confession. Defense cross-examination attempted to challenge chain of custody for evidence stored more than a decade, but prosecution demonstrated proper procedures had been followed throughout investigation. Rope fibers had been preserved specifically for future forensic analysis, anticipating technological advances that might eventually solve the case. Additional forensic testimony addressed hand-drawn maps Mcnite provided during confession. Comparison with crime scene photographs showed exact correspondence in details never published or discussed publicly. The accuracy of his drawings eliminated any possibility that his knowledge came from sources other than personal involvement. The most dramatic moment came when prosecution introduced evidence that Mcnite had led investigators to the location where he claimed to have discarded the murder weapon. The rope recovered from that site matched fiber evidence perfectly, providing definitive proof that his confession was accurate. This defendant didn't just confess to these murders, the prosecutor argued during redirect examination. He provided physical evidence that we could never have found without his cooperation. He led us to the smoking gun that proves his guilt beyond any shadow of doubt. Mcnite sat silently throughout forensic testimony, occasionally taking notes but showing no visible emotion as evidence of his crimes was presented in methodical detail. His apparent calm contrasted sharply with tension that filled the courtroom as the full scope of his violence became clear. The families of both victims attended every day, though they struggled to maintain composure as evidence revealed exactly how their children had died. Defense attorney Martinez faced the nearly impossible task of defending a client who had confessed in detail and led police to corroborating evidence. Her strategy focused on portraying Mcnite as a mentally unstable man whose confession might not accurately reflect the events of 1982. Mental illness can create false memories and inappropriate guilt, she argued to the jury. My client may believe he committed these crimes without actually being responsible for them. Depression and psychological trauma can convince people they are guilty of actions they never performed. The defense called a psychiatrist who testified that Mcnite suffered from severe depression and exhibited signs of delusional thinking that could affect his perception of reality. The expert suggested that prolonged guilt over minor infractions might have evolved into false memories of more serious crimes. In rare cases, individuals with certain psychological profiles can develop detailed false confessions that seem authentic even to trained investigators, the psychiatrist explained. The need to confess and accept punishment can become overwhelming, even when no actual crime has been committed. The defense argument struggled against physical evidence that corroborated every detail of Mcnite's confession. Cross-examination revealed the psychiatrist had never examined Mcnite directly and was basing opinions on theoretical possibilities rather than specific evaluation of defendant's mental state. Prosecution rebuttal focused on the impossibility of false confession in cases where defendants provide previously unknown physical evidence. Mcnite had led investigators to the murder weapon and crime scene details that no innocent person could have known, regardless of psychological condition. False confessions don't include accurate maps of undisclosed crime scenes, the prosecutor argued. They don't lead police to physical evidence that perfectly matches forensic analysis. The defendant's confession is true because only the killer could have provided the information he gave us. The defense's closing argument acknowledged evidence strength while pleading for jury to consider Mcnite's mental state as mitigating factor. Martinez emphasized that even guilty defendants deserve consideration of circumstances that might have affected their judgment. The prosecutor's closing emphasized victims and families who had endured 14 years of uncertainty while Mcnite lived freely in the same community where he committed his crimes. The jury deliberated for 18 hours across 2 days, carefully reviewing evidence and testimony before reaching their verdict. The courtroom filled to capacity as Judge Thompson prepared to announce the decision that would finally close Logan's most notorious criminal case. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Thompson asked the foreman, who stood with deliberation papers in his hands. "We have, Your Honor." The silence was absolute as the foreman read verdicts aloud. "On the charge of aggravated murder in the death of Annette Cooper, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of aggravated murder in the death of Todd Schultz, we find the defendant guilty." Mcnite showed no visible reaction, sitting quietly as the judge polled each juror to confirm their decision. The guilty verdicts were unanimous, reflecting the overwhelming strength of evidence presented during trial. Judge Thompson scheduled sentencing for the following month, allowing time for victim impact statements and pre-sentence investigation that would guide his decision about Mcnite's punishment. Ohio law permitted either life imprisonment or the death penalty for aggravated murder convictions. Outside the courthouse, families spoke briefly to assembled reporters, expressing gratitude for the jury's decision while acknowledging that no legal verdict could restore their children's lives or erase 14 years of suffering. "We're grateful that Chester Mcnite will finally be held accountable for what he did to Annette and Todd," Annette's father said, his voice steady despite visible emotion. "Justice has been delayed, but it hasn't been denied." Detective Morrison stood quietly at the back of the crowd, reflecting on the moment he had pursued for more than half his career. The conviction represented vindication for his refusal to abandon the case. Though he understood that legal justice could never fully heal wounds Mcnite's crimes had inflicted on Logan, the conviction made headlines across Ohio and drew national attention as an example of how persistence and forensic science could solve even decades-old crimes. Community reaction in Logan was subdued, with residents expressing relief that the case had finally been resolved while continuing to mourn the loss of two young people who had represented their town's promise and innocence. The sentencing hearing took place 4 weeks later, providing opportunity for victims' families to address Mcnite directly and for the court to impose final judgment on crimes that had haunted Hocking County for more than a decade. Annette's mother spoke first, her voice breaking as she described 14 years of wondering what had happened to her daughter and whether the killer might strike again. She recounted anniversaries marked by grief instead of celebration, holidays shadowed by absence, and constant fear that justice might never arrive. "You stole more than 2 lives," she told Mcnite, who sat about with his head bowed. "You stole our peace, our sense of safety, our ability to trust that good things could happen to good people. You turned our community into a place where parents feared for their children and neighbors suspected each other." Todd's father followed with his own statement, focusing on the young man his son would have become and the family he might have raised. He spoke about graduation ceremonies without graduates, birthday celebrations without birthday boys, and Christmas mornings when presents remained unwrapped. Victim impact statements continued for nearly 2 hours, with relatives, friends, and community members describing how the murders had affected their lives and faith in justice. Several speakers acknowledged Mcnite's decision to confess, while emphasizing that cooperation couldn't diminish the magnitude of his crimes. Mcnite was given opportunity to speak before sentencing. He stood slowly and addressed families directly, his voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I know that doesn't mean anything after what I did, but I needed you to hear me say it. I destroyed your families and your lives, and I've carried that knowledge every day for 14 years. I confess because I couldn't carry it anymore, not because I deserve forgiveness or understanding." Judge Thompson's sentencing remarks reviewed the evidence and acknowledged the family's suffering while explaining his decision to impose life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He noted Mcnite's cooperation in solving the case while emphasizing that no cooperation could excuse the brutality of his crimes. "These murders robbed Logan of its innocence and 2 families of their children," Judge Thompson concluded. "Justice requires that you spend the remainder of your life in prison, removed from the community you terrorized and the families you destroyed." The courthouse steps filled with reporters and community members as the Propo families emerged from the sentencing hearing, their 14-year journey through grief and uncertainty finally reaching its legal conclusion. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and the promise of approaching winter, marking the end of a chapter that had defined Logan for more than a decade. Annette's father paused at the microphones, his weathered face reflecting both relief and sorrow as he prepared to speak on behalf of both families. The crowd fell silent, understanding that this moment represented more than the conclusion of a criminal trial. It marked the beginning of a new relationship with tragedy that had shaped their community's identity. Today, Justice was served for Annette and Todd, he said, his voice carrying across the courthouse grounds. Chester Mcnite will spend the rest of his life in prison, where he belongs. But we want everyone to understand that this verdict doesn't bring our children back. It doesn't erase 14 years of pain and uncertainty. It simply ensures that the person responsible for their deaths can never hurt another family the way he hurt ours. Questions from reporters focused on forgiveness, closure, and the family's plans for moving forward. Both families expressed gratitude for community support throughout their ordeal, while acknowledging that healing would be a lifelong process rather than an event marked by a court proceeding. Detective Morrison stood apart from the crowd, quietly observing the scene he had worked toward for half his career. Colleagues approached to congratulate him on closing the case, though he deflected praise toward the families who had endured years of uncertainty with dignity and persistence. They never gave up hope, he told a reporter who asked about the investigation's ultimate success. Even when we had no leads, no suspects, and no new evidence, they continued to believe that someone would eventually be held accountable. Their faith in justice kept this case alive, when everything else suggested it would never be solved. The media attention began to fade as reporters filed their stories and television crews packed their equipment. Logan settled into quiet reflection about what the trial's conclusion meant for a community that had been defined by unsolved tragedy for 14 years. Evening settled over Logan as the community began processing the reality that their most notorious criminal case had finally reached its conclusion. The courthouse square, which had been filled with reporters and onlookers throughout the trial, returned to its usual quiet as residents walked home through streets that felt somehow different than they had that morning. The Cooper and Schultz families gathered privately to share their thoughts about the day's events and their hopes for the future. 14 years of shared grief had created bonds between them that extended beyond their common tragedy, forming relationships built on mutual understanding of loss that few other people could comprehend. "It feels strange," Todd's mother admitted as they sat in the Coopers' living room, surrounded by family photographs that included pictures of both victims taken just days before their deaths. "We've waited so long for this day, and now that it's here, I'm not sure how to feel. Relieved, I suppose, but also empty in a way I didn't expect." The sentiment reflected the complex reality of justice delayed. The legal system had functioned as intended, determining guilt and imposing punishment for crimes that demanded accountability. But no court proceeding could restore innocence or erase the scars that 14 years of uncertainty had carved into individual lives and community consciousness. Detective Morrison drove slowly through Logan's residential neighborhoods, past the high school where Annette and Todd had spent their final morning, past the roads that searchers had walked with flashlights in 1982, past the memorial that had been erected in their honor. The familiar landscape looked the same, though he understood that everything had changed with Mcnite's conviction. At the sheriff's office, he opened the evidence locker one final time and removed the case files that had consumed so much of his professional life. The boxes would be transferred to permanent storage, their contents serving as historical record of crimes that had challenged every assumption about safety and trust in small-town America. The rope fibers that had waited 14 years for forensic comparison were sealed in evidence bags marked "Case Closed." The photographs of the crime scene were filed alongside Mcnite's confession and the maps he had drawn to guide investigators to evidence they never could have found without his cooperation. As he locked the evidence locker for the final time, Detective Morrison reflected on the strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness that accompanied the case's resolution. The memorial service that evening drew hundreds of Logan residents to the high school football stadium, where annual vigils had kept Annette and Todd's memory alive during 14 years of uncertainty. Pastor Williams, now elderly but still serving the community, offered prayers of thanksgiving for justice received and remembrance for lives lost. The crowd was larger than any vigil since the immediate aftermath of the murders, suggesting that Mcnite's conviction had reawakened community interest in honoring the victims rather than simply mourning their absence. Children who had been born after 1982 stood alongside adults who had searched for the missing teenagers with flashlights and hope that seemed naive in retrospect. Today we remember Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz not as victims of a crime, but as young people who represented the best of our community, Pastor Williams said, his voice carrying across the stadium where both teenagers had attended football games and graduation ceremonies. Their deaths changed us, but their memory has sustained us through 14 years of seeking truth and justice. The service concluded with the lighting of memorial candles, a tradition that had continued every year since 1982. The flames flickered in the autumn darkness, creating pools of light that seemed to push back against shadows that had covered Logan for too long. Several residents approached the families after the service to share memories of Annette and Todd that had been preserved despite the passage of years. Former classmates spoke about friendships that had been cut short, teachers recalled students who had shown promise that would never be fulfilled, and neighbors remembered young people who had embodied the small-town values of kindness and responsibility. The sharing of memories marked a subtle shift in how the community related to the tragedy that had defined them for so long. With Mcnite's conviction, Annette and Todd could be remembered for their lives rather than their deaths, for their potential rather than their victimization, for the joy they had brought to others rather than the grief that followed their loss. Detective Morrison attended the memorial service as he had for 14 years, though his presence carried different meaning now that the case was closed. He stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, reflecting on the journey that had taken him from a missing persons report to a double homicide conviction. The plaque was unveiled 6 months later on a spring morning that carried the scent of blooming flowers and the promise of renewal. Located near the entrance to Logan High School, the memorial bore the names of Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz, alongside an inscription that had been chosen by their families after months of careful consideration. "Truth may sleep but never dies," the bronze plaque read, quoting words found in Annette's personal journal that had been discovered among her belongings years after her death. The phrase seemed to capture both the long silence that had followed their murders and the eventual emergence of justice through Mcnite's confession. The dedication ceremony drew many of the same faces that had filled the courthouse during Mcnite's trial, though the atmosphere was celebratory rather than somber. Community members spoke about moving forward while maintaining memory, about healing that preserved rather than erased the lessons learned from tragedy. Detective Morrison, now retired from active duty but still living in Logan, offered brief remarks about the importance of persistence in seeking truth and justice. He credited the families with maintaining faith during years when evidence was scarce and leads were exhausted, emphasizing that their refusal to accept defeat had kept the case alive until Mcnite's conscience compelled him to confess. Some cases are solved through brilliant detective work, others through scientific breakthroughs, and ever down. Still others through simple luck, he said, addressing the crowd that had gathered for the dedication. This case was solved through the power of memory and the refusal of good people to let evil triumph through silence. Annette and Todd's families never gave up, and neither did this community. The memorial became part of Logan's landscape, a permanent reminder of lives lost and justice eventually served. Students walking to class passed the plaque daily, learning about two teenagers whose deaths had shaped their town's character decades before their own births. Local elementary schools began including the story of Annette Cooper and Todd Schultz in their curriculum about community history, presenting their lives and deaths as examples of both tragedy and resilience. Teachers emphasized the importance of remembering victims while celebrating the persistence that ultimately brought their killer to justice. The annual memorial services continued, though they evolved from gatherings focused on seeking justice to celebrations of memory and community strength. The tradition that had begun in grief became a celebration of endurance, faith, and the power of truth to emerge even after long years of darkness.